Dog refuses to leave abandoned car. Cops turn pale when they open the door. Mrs. Patterson lived a quiet life on the edge of a small, close-knit town where rolling meadows and weathered fences marked the boundaries of solitude. At the far end of her property sat an old, rusting Chevy, its once vibrant blue paint now chipped and faded to a dull, lifeless gray. The car hadn't moved in years, left untouched since her late husband had last parked it there. To Mrs. Patterson, it was a bittersweet relic, a silent monument to memories she wasn't ready to let go of. The townsfolk, however, often wondered why she hadn't towed it away. The first time the dog appeared, no one noticed. The stray was a scrappy-looking thing, its coat matted and patchy, eyes sharp and alert. It wasn't unusual for animals to wander through the meadow, but this dog didn't just pass through. It stayed. Over the following days, Mrs. Patterson began seeing the dog more frequently, lying beneath the Chevy or darting into the field when someone approached. From her kitchen window, she often spotted its watchful gaze fixed on the car, its posture tense and ready to defend its makeshift shelter. At first, the neighbors were indifferent. Strays came and went, and Mrs. Patterson figured the dog would move on once it realized no food or warmth could be found in the old car. But it didn't leave. Instead, it grew more territorial, barking ferociously at anyone who came too close. Children who ventured near the field were warned to stay away, their parents afraid of the dog's sharp teeth and unyielding demeanor. Yet, despite its aggression, there was something oddly calculated about its behavior. It wasn't a wild animal acting out of fear or hunger. It was a guardian. Days turned into weeks, and the dog remained a fixture in the meadow. Some neighbors, moved by its determination, began leaving scraps of food near the fence. Even Mrs. Patterson started tossing bits of bread or leftover stew toward the edge of the property. Still, no one dared approach the Chevy, intimidated by the stray's unrelenting growls. Bella, as Mrs. Patterson had begun to call her, seemed to regard the car as sacred ground. One night, the tranquility of the meadow was shattered by a sound that pierced the chilly air, a high-pitched, mournful whining that echoed across the field. From her porch, Mrs. Patterson could hear it clearly, the dog's cries filled with an urgency that made her heart race. She grabbed a flashlight and peered into the darkness, but Bella's form was barely visible near the Chevy. Unsure of what to do, Mrs. Patterson decided to call the police. "It sounds like she's in pain," she explained over the phone, her voice shaking slightly. "I think she needs help." Within minutes, the blue and red lights of a patrol car flashed against the trees lining the road. Officers Carter and Hayes stepped out, their breath visible in the cold night air. They were seasoned officers, used to handling all manner of strange calls, but something about Mrs. Patterson's trembling voice had made them approach this one with caution. "She's by the car," Mrs. Patterson whispered as they reached the porch. "I've never heard her sound like this before." The officers exchanged a glance, their curiosity piqued. Flashlights in hand, they crossed the meadow, the frost crunching beneath their boots. Bella's cries grew louder as they approached, transforming into guttural, protective barks. Her silhouette became clearer, her body rigid, her eyes glowing in the beam of their flashlights. "Easy, girl," Officer Carter murmured, holding out a hand as though the dog might understand the gesture. Bella didn't retreat, but neither did she lunge. Instead, she stood her ground, her sharp barks punctuating the silence around them. "Something's got her riled up," Officer Hayes said under his breath, stepping closer to the Chevy. His flashlight swept over the vehicle's exterior, rusting panels, shattered windows, and a half-open door. Bella's barking intensified, but there was no sign of a struggle, no immediate threat that either officer could detect. "Let's take a look inside," Carter suggested, his voice steady despite the unease creeping into his mind. Hayes nodded and reached for the car's handle. Bella's growls grew louder, but she didn't attempt to stop him. Instead, she circled the vehicle, her posture tense but almost expectant, as though waiting for them to uncover whatever had held her so firmly to this place. The door creaked open slowly, its hinges groaning in protest. Both officers leaned in, their flashlights sweeping over the car's interior. At first it seemed empty, just a mess of torn upholstery, tattered blankets, and debris that hinted at years of abandonment. But then, a faint sound emerged, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. It was a whimper, weak and trembling. "Did you hear that?" Carter asked, his flashlight frozen on the back seat. Hayes nodded, his brow furrowing as he moved closer. He reached for the pile of blankets, carefully pulling them back. His breath caught in his throat as the beam of his flashlight revealed the source of the sound, a tiny, trembling baby curled up in the middle of the seat. "Dear God," Hayes whispered, his voice barely audible. The baby's skin was pale, its small body swaddled in threadbare cloth that did little to keep out the cold. Tears streaked its tiny cheeks, and its cries, though faint, carried a piercing desperation. "Get EMS here now," Carter barked, pulling his radio from his belt. Hayes carefully scooped the baby into his arms, his movements slow and deliberate, as though afraid the child might shatter. As Carter relayed the situation to dispatch, Bella's barking finally ceased. The dog sat back on her haunches, watching intently as Hayes cradled the baby. Her eyes, once filled with hostility, now seemed to hold a quiet relief, as though her mission had finally been understood. "Who could have done this?" Hayes asked, his voice thick with emotion as the baby's cries grew louder. Carter didn't respond, his jaw set tight as he scanned the meadow for any sign of the person who had left the child behind. The faint wail of an approaching ambulance broke the silence, and Bella's ears twitched in acknowledgement. As paramedics took the baby into their care, Bella stayed rooted to her spot near the Chevy. She didn't bark or growl, but her eyes never left the paramedics' hands as they bundled the infant into a warm blanket. It was as if she understood that her job wasn't quite finished yet. The officers and Mrs. Patterson stood in stunned silence as the ambulance sped away, its sirens cutting through the night. The questions that hung in the air were almost too heavy to voice. Who had left the baby in the car? And why? Bella's presence remained a mystery of its own, but one thing was clear: the stray dog's fierce loyalty had saved a life. As the paramedics carried the baby away that night, the old Chevy stood silent in the meadow, its rusted frame now more than just a discarded relic. It had become a scene of wonder, mystery, and unanswered questions. Bella, the stray dog who had refused to leave the car, stayed seated by its side, her sharp eyes following every move the officers and neighbors made. The night's events were the talk of the town before the sun even rose. The next morning, the local paper ran a headline that captured everyone's attention. "Baby found in abandoned car, a mystery unfolds." Reporters swarmed the meadow, their cameras trained on the rusted vehicle. Neighbors who had been skeptical of Bella's constant presence now looked at her with a mix of awe and curiosity. Mrs. Patterson watched the commotion from her porch, her heart heavy with worry for the baby she had seen just hours before. She had called the hospital earlier and learned the infant, a girl, was stable but still under observation. The nurses hadn't shared much else, though Mrs. Patterson could sense the gravity in their tone. Meanwhile, Officers Carter and Hayes returned to the scene at first light, determined to comb through every inch of the Chevy for clues. The previous night had been a whirlwind of emotions, but now, in the light of day, they approached the investigation with a clearer focus. Bella, true to form, remained near the car, watching the officers with a mix of calm and vigilance. Carter crouched near the back seat where the baby had been found. The blankets were still there, along with a small pile of what appeared to be belongings left for the infant. He carefully pulled each item into the sunlight for inspection. A weathered teddy bear with one missing eye, a worn pacifier clipped to a scrap of fabric, and, most intriguing, a faded photograph of a young woman. The picture showed a smiling woman in her early 20s, her dark hair tucked behind her ears. There was no name, no date, no location written on the back. It was the kind of image that might have come from an old photo booth or a cheap camera. "Do you think this could be the mother?" Carter asked, handing the photograph to Hayes. Maybe, Hayes replied, studying the image, or someone close to her. Either way, this is the best lead we've got. The officers decided to take the photo and teddy bear to the station for further investigation. Hayes tucked them carefully into an evidence bag, his movements deliberate. Bella, sitting a few feet away, let out a low whine as she watched the bear disappear into Hayes' hands. Her reaction made the officers pause. "You think she recognizes these?" Carter mused aloud. Hayes shrugged, though his eyes lingered on Bella. There was something almost human in the dog's behavior, a level of understanding that neither officer could explain. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Patterson approached cautiously, her hands tucked into the pockets of her cardigan. "Officers," she called, her voice tentative but steady. "Any news about the baby?" Carter shook his head. "She's stable, but we're still trying to figure out who left her there." Mrs. Patterson hesitated, glancing at Bella. "The dog," she began. "She hasn't left that car in weeks, not even to chase the rabbits in the field. Do you think she was guarding the baby?" Hayes and Carter exchanged a look. It was a question that had crossed their minds more than once. "It's possible," Hayes admitted. "Dogs have instincts we can't always explain." Mrs. Patterson nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "I called the hospital this morning," she added. "I wanted to check on her. The nurses said she's doing well." Carter offered a small smile. "That's good to hear. Have you given her a name?" Mrs. Patterson asked softly. "Not officially," Hayes replied. "She's still a Jane Doe for now. Mrs. Patterson thought for a moment before saying, "Sophie, that's what I'd call her. After my daughter." The officers nodded respectfully, making a mental note of the name. As they walked back to their patrol car, Bella followed at a distance, her steps slow and deliberate. She stopped short of the driveway, sitting down as though signaling she wouldn't go further. "She's sticking to that car like glue," Carter observed, glancing back at the Chevy. "We might need her," Hayes said, half joking, though the idea wasn't entirely far-fetched. That afternoon, Carter and Hayes began canvassing the neighborhood with the photograph. They knocked on every door within a 2-mile radius, asking if anyone recognized the young woman in the picture. Most people shook their heads, offering polite condolences, but no useful information. A few thought they might have seen someone similar passing through town months ago, but the details were vague and unhelpful. At the hospital, the baby remained a mystery. The nurses had cleaned her up, dressed her in a soft onesie, and swaddled her in a fresh blanket. Sophie, as Mrs. Patterson had called her, seemed oblivious to the stir she had caused. She gurgled quietly in her crib, her tiny fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. Several nurses took turns checking on her, their faces soft with affection. One nurse, Emily, couldn't help but linger by Sophie's side. "Who would leave a baby like this?" she murmured to her colleague, her voice thick with emotion. "Someone who thought they didn't have a choice," the other nurse replied. "At least they left her with blankets and that bear. They must have cared, even if they couldn't keep her." Meanwhile, Carter and Hayes continued their investigation. Back at the station, they searched national databases for missing persons, hoping the photograph would match someone reported missing. The results were frustratingly inconclusive. The picture was too old, too generic. It could have been anyone. As the day stretched into evening, the officers found themselves back at Mrs. Patterson's house. Bella greeted them at the porch, her tail wagging faintly. Mrs. Patterson invited them inside, offering coffee and a quiet place to regroup. They discussed their progress, or lack thereof, while Bella sat at their feet, her head resting on her paws. "What about the teddy bear?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "Could it have any identifying marks?" Carter frowned, realizing they hadn't examined the bear closely enough. He pulled it from the evidence bag and turned it over in his hands. It was worn and threadbare, but as he ran his fingers over the fabric, he felt a faint indentation near the seam. Carefully, he opened it and found a small piece of paper tucked inside. Written in shaky handwriting were 2 words: "For Sophie." The room fell silent. Mrs. Patterson's hand flew to her mouth, and Hayes stared at the note as though it were a lifeline. She named her, Hayes said softly. And she wanted her found, Carter added. Mrs. Patterson looked at Bella, whose eyes seemed to glimmer with a mix of sadness and resolve. Whoever left Sophie wanted her to have a chance, she whispered. And this dog made sure she got it. The mystery wasn't solved, but for the first time, they felt closer to understanding the human story behind the rusted car and the loyal stray. The weeks after Sophie's discovery passed slowly, with the investigation into her origins yielding little progress. Officers Carter and Hayes had followed countless leads, knocking on doors, showing the photograph to locals, and scouring the town for anyone who might recognize the young woman in the picture. Despite their best efforts, no one came forward with concrete answers. Sophie remained a mystery, a baby found in an abandoned car, with nothing but a teddy bear, a photograph, and a loyal dog to connect her to the life she had left behind. Meanwhile, Bella's attachment to the car and Sophie hadn't waned. The dog continued to patrol the meadow, circling the Chevy as though waiting for something, or someone. Mrs. Patterson, who had grown fond of Bella's presence, began letting the dog sleep on her porch. She fed Bella scraps from her kitchen, talking softly to her as though she could understand. I know you're waiting for her, Mrs. Patterson would say, stroking Bella's matted fur, but she's safe now, I promise. Despite Mrs. Patterson's reassurances, Bella remained restless. The dog often wandered toward the meadow, sitting near the car with her ears perked and her nose in the air, as if searching for a scent only she could detect. The townspeople had started to notice Bella's odd behavior. Children whispered about the guardian dog that refused to leave its post, while adults speculated about her connection to Sophie. One afternoon, Mrs. Patterson was sweeping her porch when she noticed Bella acting strangely. The dog paced back and forth, whining softly and scratching at the wooden planks near the door. What's wrong, girl? Mrs. Patterson asked, setting down her broom. Bella looked up at her, her brown eyes filled with urgency. She barked once, then bolted toward the meadow, pausing only to glance back at Mrs. Patterson as though urging her to follow. Mrs. Patterson hesitated for a moment before grabbing her coat. All right, she muttered, hurrying after the dog. Bella led her straight to the Chevy, circling the car and barking insistently. By the time Mrs. Patterson reached the field, she was out of breath and bewildered. What is it, Bella? There's nothing here. But Bella didn't stop. She continued barking, her nose pressed to the ground as she sniffed along the edge of the car. Mrs. Patterson realized Bella wasn't just barking. She was trying to lead her somewhere. The dog began moving toward the woods at the edge of the property, pausing every few steps to look back and ensure Mrs. Patterson was following. Mrs. Patterson's heart raced as she watched Bella's determined movements. She had no idea what the dog was chasing, but the urgency in her behavior was impossible to ignore. As Mrs. Patterson followed Bella into the woods, she called the police. Officers Carter and Hayes, please, she told the dispatcher. It's about the dog, the one from the baby case. She's acting strange again. By the time Carter and Hayes arrived, Bella had led Mrs. Patterson deep into the forest. The officers found her near a tall fence that marked the boundary between Mrs. Patterson's property and the neighboring township. Bella was scratching at the ground near the base of the fence, barking frantically. She's been like this for 10 minutes, Mrs. Patterson explained, her voice tinged with both fear and hope. I think she's trying to show us something. Carter and Hayes exchanged a glance before pulling on their gloves. Let's see where she's going, Carter said, climbing over the fence. Hayes followed, and Mrs. Patterson, despite her age, managed to hoist herself over with their help. Bella waited on the other side, her tail wagging impatiently before she darted deeper into the woods. The group moved cautiously through the underbrush, their flashlights cutting through the dim light of the late afternoon. Bella's barking grew more insistent the farther they went, her nose pressed to the ground as though tracking a scent. The woods grew denser, the trees pressing closer together and blocking out what little sunlight remained. This is getting eerie, Hayes muttered, brushing aside a low-hanging branch. What could she possibly be leading us to? I don't know, Carter replied, his tone wary. But we've come this far. Let's keep going. Suddenly, Bella stopped. She stood at the edge of a small clearing, her ears perked and her body tense. In the center of the clearing stood an old, decrepit house, its windows shattered and its walls covered in peeling paint and graffiti. The roof sagged in places, and the entire structure leaned slightly to one side, as though it might collapse under its own weight. Bella barked once, then trotted toward the house, her movements careful but purposeful. This place looks like it hasn't been lived in for years, Carter said, shining his flashlight over the rotting wood of the porch. Hayes frowned. Maybe not lived in, but it's been used. Look at the footprints. He pointed to a trail of faint marks in the dirt leading up to the front door. Bella reached the porch and began barking again, her paws scratching at the door. Carter and Hayes exchanged a glance before drawing their weapons. Stay back, Carter instructed Mrs. Patterson. We'll check it out. Mrs. Patterson nodded, clutching her coat tightly around her. Bella whined as the officers stepped past her and pushed the door open. The hinges groaned loudly, and the smell of mildew and decay wafted out, making Hayes wrinkle his nose. Inside, the house was dark and silent, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and rot. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, along with empty food containers and crumpled blankets. This is definitely a squat, Hayes muttered, stepping over a pile of debris. Stay close, Carter replied, his flashlight sweeping over the walls. Bella followed them inside, her tail low and her body tense. The dog led them up a narrow staircase to the second floor, her barks growing louder with each step. At the end of a hallway, they found a room with a single mattress on the floor. A young woman lay curled up on it, her face pale and her breathing shallow. She didn't stir as the officers entered, but Bella rushed to her side, whining softly. Ma'am? Carter said gently, lowering his flashlight. The woman's eyes fluttered open, and she blinked up at them in confusion. Who are you? She whispered, her voice barely audible. We're here to help, Hayes replied. Do you have a baby? Tears welled up in the woman's eyes as she nodded weakly. Sophie, is she okay? She's safe, Carter assured her. We found her. She's at the hospital. The woman let out a sob, her body shaking as she tried to sit up. Bella pressed closer to her, nuzzling her hand as though offering comfort. I couldn't take care of her, the woman said through her tears. I thought someone would find her and keep her safe. We're going to get you help, Hayes said firmly, pulling out his radio. You're not alone anymore. As the officers called for medical assistance, Mrs. Patterson stepped into the room, her heart breaking at the sight of the young woman. Bella sat at her feet, her mission finally complete. For the first time in weeks, the dog's barking stopped, replaced by a quiet, satisfied whine. The young woman, Emma, was quickly transported to the hospital, her frail body supported by paramedics as they loaded her into the ambulance. She was exhausted, malnourished, and visibly weak, but her relief at learning Sophie was safe seemed to lend her a fleeting strength. Bella watched the ambulance pull away, her head tilting slightly, as if understanding that her role in this part of the story was coming to an end. At the hospital, Mrs. Patterson and Officers Carter and Hayes stayed close, eager for updates. Emma's condition was fragile, but the doctors assured them she would recover with rest and proper care. While she was being examined, Mrs. Patterson sat in the waiting room, her mind racing with thoughts of the young woman and the struggles she must have faced. Bella had followed her to the hospital and was now lying quietly by her feet, her head resting on her paws. The once aggressive stray was now a picture of calm, her protective instincts still intact, but softened by the knowledge that Sophie was safe. Hours later, the doctors allowed Mrs. Patterson and the officers to visit Emma. She was sitting upright in her hospital bed, her face pale but her eyes more alert. When they entered the room, she looked up with a mix of gratitude and vulnerability. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for finding her." Mrs. Patterson approached cautiously, her heart aching for the young woman. "Sophie's a strong little girl," she said softly. "She's doing just fine." Emma's eyes filled with tears at the mention of her daughter's name. "I didn't know what else to do," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't take care of her out there. I thought if I left her somewhere safe, someone would find her and give her a better life." Carter stepped forward, his tone gentle but firm. "Emma, can you tell us what happened? Why were you living in that house?" Emma nodded slowly, gathering her thoughts. "It wasn't always like this," she began, her gaze distant. "I had a job, a place to stay, but when I got pregnant, things fell apart. My partner left and I couldn't afford the rent anymore. I ended up on the streets." Her voice cracked as she continued, the weight of her story spilling out in broken fragments. "I tried to keep Sophie warm, to feed her, but it wasn't enough. I found the car in the meadow and thought it was safe. I left her there with the blankets and the bear, hoping someone would find her before it got too cold." Mrs. Patterson reached for Emma's hand, her own eyes welling with tears. "You did what you thought was best for her," she said softly, "and Bella made sure she was protected." At the sound of her name, Bella lifted her head and wagged her tail faintly. Emma looked at the dog, her expression shifting from surprise to awe. "She stayed with Sophie?" she asked. Carter nodded. "The dog never left her side. She led us to you." Emma reached out hesitantly, her hand trembling as Bella stepped closer. The dog sniffed her hand, then nuzzled it gently as if to reassure her. "Thank you," Emma whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you for watching over her." The officers stayed for a while longer, asking Emma more questions and promising to help her get back on her feet. By the time they left, Emma was visibly calmer, though the exhaustion of her ordeal still weighed heavily on her. Mrs. Patterson lingered a little longer, sensing that Emma needed more than just answers. She needed support. "Emma," she said gently, "do you have anywhere to go once you're discharged?" Emma shook her head. "Not really. I've been living day to day for so long. I don't even know where to start." Mrs. Patterson hesitated, then spoke with quiet determination. "You'll come stay with me. I have plenty of room, and Sophie will need a stable place while you get back on your feet." Emma's eyes widened in disbelief. "I can't ask you to do that," she said quickly. "You're not asking," Mrs. Patterson replied with a small smile. "I'm offering. We've already been through so much together, haven't we? Let's figure this out as a family." Tears streamed down Emma's face as she nodded, unable to find the words to express her gratitude. Bella wagged her tail more enthusiastically now, sensing the relief in the room. Over the next few weeks, Emma, Sophie, and Bella settled into Mrs. Patterson's home. The small house, once so quiet and still, was now filled with life. Sophie's giggles echoed through the halls as she grew stronger each day, her tiny hands reaching for everything with a curious determination. Bella followed her everywhere, her protective instincts undiminished. The dog had gone from stray to family member, her loyalty now shared with Emma and Mrs. Patterson as well. Emma began to recover, both physically and emotionally. Mrs. Patterson helped her connect with local resources, including job placement services and parenting support groups. The community, moved by the story of the baby in the abandoned car, rallied around them, donating clothes, toys, and other essentials for Sophie. Even Officers Carter and Hayes visited regularly, bringing updates on the case and sharing meals with the growing family. One evening as the sun set over the meadow, Mrs. Patterson sat on the porch with Emma, Sophie, and Bella by her side. The air was filled with the sound of crickets and the soft hum of the breeze. Emma held Sophie in her lap, her fingers brushing through the baby's fine hair. Bella lay at their feet, her head resting on her paws, her eyes half closed in contentment. "Sometimes I wonder how it all happened," Emma said softly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "If Bella hadn't stayed with her, if you hadn't called the police." Mrs. Patterson reached over and squeezed Emma's hand. "It happened because it was meant to," she replied. "And now we're here, together." Emma smiled, her heart full of gratitude. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of hope. Sophie gurgled happily in her arms, oblivious to the challenges they had overcome, and Bella wagged her tail in the fading light. In the days that followed, life settled into a comforting routine. Emma started a part-time job at a local shop, and Sophie began to explore the world around her with wide-eyed wonder. Bella, ever watchful, remained Sophie's constant companion, her loyalty earning her a special place in the hearts of everyone who met her. The old Chevy, now cleared from the meadow, had been a place of desperation and hope, but its story was no longer the defining thread of their lives. Instead, the family that had formed in its wake became a testament to resilience, love, and the extraordinary bonds that can grow in the most unexpected of circumstances.